Okay, listen, you are doing way too much and it's not making your games any better. D&D is a game that already offloads so much of the work of the game to the Dungeon Master, so you don't need to be taking even more of that load onto yourself by thinking that everything needs to be a carefully guarded secret, revealed only at the most opportune moment. In this video, you and me are going to get you out of those unhealthy habits that are burning you out, and we're going to make your game better at the same time. And we're going to do so in an engagement-friendly, numbered list. Number 1, you aren't a content machine, and no one wants you to be one. If I had to give one piece of advice to new Dungeon Masters, it would be to get out of the mindset that you are creating and presenting content to your players every game. That mindset makes you incredibly emotionally attached to a game and puts a ton of pressure on you, where really it just shouldn't be the case. A good gaming session should be as much your players pushing the game forward as you, and the game itself should be providing you with tools to generate the content that you haven't planned. That's what I meant earlier when I said that D&D offloads way too much of the work to the Dungeon Master. What you and I are going to do is put systems into our game that are content-making machines that rely on evocative random generation and player-driven storytelling. So, you might think, well, doesn't that mean I can't create custom experiences for my players? No, and this isn't a Q&A. Keep your questions till the end and please put them in the comments. Asking me here doesn't help engagement at all, and it's distracting for the others. Thank you. You should lean on curated random generation. What do I mean by that? I said keep your questions in the comments. Well, it could be as simple as using a random encounter table that fits the environs your players are in. If your players are in a swamp, then use the Dungeon Master's encounter table for random swamp monsters. You could also make your own tables that fit the world that you've created. Let's say you're playing in a Star Wars galaxy. The Outer Rim is going to have encounter tables with more space pirates and gangsters than stormtroopers. Now, my biggest complaint with encounter tables that are just 1d4 of this type of monster is that they're just not super evocative. It's a monster, but no story. I'd love a different kind of encounter table that was more evocative. Like, you find a shambling mound lurching around with a green hag that's screaming from inside. That's evocative. It's a whole story in a sentence. So if you're worried about not having the right miniatures, resources, terrain for a specific encounter that you might roll, you can ask your players ahead of time where they're going to be heading to make sure that you bring resources that fit that curated encounter table that they might roll. You can also pre-roll on encounter tables so that if players get a couple encounters in that session, you've already pre-built them. You have all the resources that you need. All of this, though, is only possible if you're willing to communicate with your players, which leads us to number 2. Pass the ball back to your players constantly. Offload as much narrative work as possible to them. Not sure what cool things would be inside this town? Ask the players what cool landmarks the town is famous for the moment they walk in. Once they say it, now it's canon, and everyone's got to deal with it. You don't have to pretend that you've accounted for every scenario. That's insane. You're only human, and this is just a game. You don't have to pretend to be God. People will say that this is a collaborative storytelling game, but then hold on to the plot reins with sweaty hands, holding on to secrets and plot reveals like they're narrative Da Vinci's, and the players are simply putty in the hands of their master-crafted narrative. So that's number 3. Know when to reveal secrets. I guarantee you that your story will be way better if you loosen the grip and lower the veil sometimes. If something unexpected happens that you're not sure about the outcome for, good. That's what the dice are for. That's why we roll them. And if you're not sure how to adjudicate a result, let the players know what you're thinking and why. Then maybe by explaining, you can all come to a decision that makes sense to everyone around the table, or you can roll between 2 equally likely options and everyone will be happy with the result because they understood how it occurred. Let me give you an example. My players were investigating a disappearance of a village girl, and when they found her, they had discovered that she was murdered and had risen as a vengeful ghost. Now, the players had uncovered very specific information in their investigation that could either calm the ghost down or cause her to go on a rampage. Now, instead of hiding that information, I put a tracker on top of my DM screen. Anytime they said something that enraged her or failed a check, I moved the tracker closer towards a skull, which meant combat. Every time they said something that appeased her, I moved the tracker further away from the skull. This had the dual benefit of offloading the mental load of trying to keep track of this monster's mental state in my own brain, and allowed the players to know to be very careful in dealing with this monster who was very emotionally unstable. They still had to get some information out of her to continue their investigation, but that very visible tracker made it clear where the conversation was in my mind. After that, they had to speak to a Legion soldier named Umbria, who'd been investigating the disappearance of a centurion named Sextus, who was sent to this village to negotiate the trade deal. Well, it turned out that this village girl had a tryst with him, and her father found out, killed them both, and now her daughter had come back to haunt him. Now, since the party knew that the village would likely be burned and looted if the Legion found out that a village elder had murdered a centurion, they had to convince Umbria not to report back the truth. So I told them exactly what was going through her mind. The party had captured the murderous elder, which meant that they could bring him to justice, but justice wouldn't be enough for the Legion if they had the truth. They'd have to make the village an example, which means looting and burning. So they pitched to Umbria that they could execute this elder here for justice, but tell the Legion that the soldier was just killed by some monsters in the woods. The problem for Umbria was that if the truth ever came out, it would be her who was executed. Now, knowing this and knowing how interesting and complex it was, I told the players exactly what was going through Umbria's mind. You could probably do this with a skill check, and I think I probably did one in the moment, but it was just so important to me that they knew what the stakes were in the moment for this character, to let them know, for me as a DM, that I could see this situation going one way or another, depending on what guarantees that they could offer Umbria and how well they could roll. That's one example of making your thought process more visible to your players, which is great, but what it isn't is an example of how to make your life easier and your game better at the same time. Let's get into players' backstory stuff, which I think are the secrets most DMs out there like to hold closest to the chest and are the most protective about. Here comes the hot take. A well-placed surprise reveal can be a really cool moment in a D&D campaign, I'll admit that. But the amount of botched secret reveals I've seen happen far exceed the successful ones. Now, this can be due to a number of things. Maybe the player wrote a backstory that the DM misunderstood, and the reveal confused everyone instead of being a cool moment. Maybe the player literally forgot the most important character in their backstory, and someone was brought up, they were like, who? And also, these moments are often really only cool for one person at the table, so if it falls flat for them, it falls flat for everyone. You can avoid these embarrassing reveals by not making the reveal itself the surprise, and instead make the timing of the reveal the surprise. Okay, example time again. One of my players gave me a backstory where he and two other Dragonborn soldiers known as the Three-Headed Dragon were best friends and legends among the Legion and got captured and experimented on by druids. And once they got away from those druids, arcanists from the empire that they worked for captured them to do their own experiments. My player's character got away, but his friends didn't. I knew this was going to come back soon and had a pretty good idea of how, but hadn't made mention of it as part of the story until the party got to some sort of library, archive bookstore, and rolled a natural 20 investigation check. And in this house, we respect the natural 20. So, I put my cards on the table. I said they found a report from an investigative journalist who was interested in covering the disappearance of the legendary Three-Headed Dragon legionaries. She ended up following a trail that led to the Empire's arcanists and witnessed the escape. But she saw details that my friend's character didn't. She saw one of the Dragonborn soldiers cut down in the escape, but she also saw that one survived. Weeks later, she came back and saw the surviving Dragonborn leading a troop of soldiers north, the direction of the party. So now, the reveal changed. Instead of wondering what I'm going to do with his backstory, now it's a sword of Damocles hanging over his head. He's wondering when I'm going to drop it on him. Spoiler alert, it'll be at the worst possible time. But you see what I mean? That's a backstory that isn't a secret anymore, but instead of ruining it, now the whole party is engaged. They're all wondering when this Dragonborn is going to track them down, and honestly, that's way cooler. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you to my patrons for supporting the content I'm bringing to you. I'm Ben DeHart, and if you like this video, subscribe and come back to catch the next one. And if you have a good example of when not holding on to your secrets has made the game better, I'd love to read about it in the comments. See ya.